Hi, good afternoon. This is Mark Osmak, and this is the fourth or fifth installment of Ask a Candidate question, which we do every single Thursday at 1 o'clock Central Standard Time. So today we're going to be talking about what today is, and that is International Women's Day. And so a lot to talk about as far as just where they've come, where women's rights have come from, say, a little over 100 years ago, and where we're at now. And definitely there's been a lot of progress, but it is most certainly not enough. And so there's quite a way to go still. And we're not going to stop until women get equal rights across the board, to include pay that men have. So for me, being in the Army, it's slightly a bit of a military focus. So women have served in combat from the very beginning. So I was an artillery officer, and so there's a famous story of Molly Pitcher, who manned the guns, or womaned the guns, so to speak, after her husband was killed. And so she continued firing the cannon in the Revolutionary War. And so there's now a award in the field artillery branch of the Army called Molly Pitcher, and that is for a spouse that has contributed a lot and made a huge difference and benefit to the United States Army field artillery branch. So that's kind of the initial background. They've served in every single conflict since then, but believe it or not, it was not until 1978, 4 short years before I was born, that women were fully integrated into the United States Army. So before then, they had the Women's Army Corps, better known as WAC. Before that, there were several different groups that had in the Army for women. So this is just to kind of remind everybody, this is before the Air Force was a separate branch. So at that time, the Army and the Army Air Corps were connected, and it wasn't until several years after World War II that the Air Force split away and became their own respective branch. So during that time, there were quite a few different groups that unfortunately most people don't know about. One was called WAC, that's two A's, so WAAC, and another one called WASP, and that's WASP. And WASP is an acronym for Women's Auxiliary Service Pilot. And so what they would do, they would not allow women to serve in combat at that time, in a combat role, so they were medics or they were nurses on the battlefield, but they were not in an actual designated combat role. So what WASPs would do, the Women's Auxiliary Service Pilots, what they would do is they would ferry planes after they were made, and a lot of them here in St. Louis and in Missouri, they would ferry them to other nations. So the thought was, while men were flying B-17s, B-24s, P-51s, Hellcats, Bearcats, everything else, that they wouldn't waste men's flying capabilities in ferrying aircraft. And so women became the designated group to fly the newly completed aircraft to most typically and likely England. Then there they'd be kind of picked up and ferried across to go fight on the Eastern Front, or sorry, in Germany. And now here's Gretzky on my lap. So that's kind of a very, very brief overview of that. I had a great internship in 2004 that focused on women in the military, and so that was even more specific to women in the military in St. Louis. So that was when I was at the Missouri Historical Museum, the one right off of Forest Park Parkway near Forest Park. So I did that for an entire summer and learned a tremendous amount about what they did. And as you could probably imagine, they were not recognized for their service for decades after that. So even though that if they were killed or if they did die while ferrying those aircraft across the Atlantic Ocean, and decades after the war, it took a long time for them to be recognized as military veterans and get those honors that were due to them. On my Twitter feed, which is Mark_Osmak, that's my handle on Twitter. There, I put a post on there from World War I Museum, which is in Kansas City, Missouri, and that's talking about another group that I did not know anything about until today. That women during World War I were recruited to handle this new technology, widespread technology, the telephone. And so they were required to be bilingual. So that was a really interesting thing that I did not know about. And so it wasn't until recently that they were just able to get their recognition for serving during the First Great War, World War I. So that's the background. Now, where we're at now, it was not until, as far as the military goes, it was not until just several years ago that women were allowed to serve in combat roles. And so the difference between women serving in the military, which they have for a long time, as I mentioned, but they were not allowed to go into combat, what the Army calls MOSs, but combat jobs. So specifically, for instance, in the Army, that'd be infantry, artillery, they are special forces. They were not allowed to do that up until just several years ago. And the United States Marine Corps actually was the last branch to fully integrate women to allow them to participate in infantry school, and that's at the enlisted and the officer level. So one of the last things I remember I was working on in DC when I was working on the House Armed Services Committee, the Marine Corps wanted to do a study on women's feet. And the reason why is because they said that a woman's foot is not just a shrunken down version of a man's foot, that it is different. And so they had to do a study on how to best supply boots for women. Seemed a little bit to me, they were dragging their feet, no pun intended, on that. So my thoughts on women serving in combat is a resounding and loud and clear yes. And here's why. Aside from them being completely equal, there is a self-selection process that I don't think gets a lot of attention for the military as far as who wants to perform in different roles. So what do I mean by that? Well, we have 5 branches of service: the Army, the Navy, the Air Force, the Marine Corps, and the Coast Guard. And so there are certain types of people that are going to want to join the military. So that's the first self-selection of that. Do I want to join the military? Do I want to do an active duty, or do I want to go in the reserve or National Guard or Air National Guard route? So that's the first question. Then once you get past that, think of it just like a pyramid. Once you get past that, what kind of job do you want to have? In the Army, we call it an MOS, a military occupational specialty. But all that is just a fancy acronym for what's your job? What are you focused on? So the Army and the military have every job you can imagine in the civilian world, and then some available in them. So you have to join the military, and then you get to pick, if you're enlisted, your specific job, your specific MOS. And if you're an officer, you could pick what the Army calls a branch, but a generalized area. So for me, I was artillery, and then you kind of specialize from there. So do you want to join the military? Yes or no? If the answer is yes, great. Then you go up to the next level. Do you want to serve in a combat role? So there's different parts of that. So there's combat support, and so there's infantry, but say, for instance, combat support would be, artillery is considered that, engineers. So you can go into that route. So for me, I chose artillery, so then you kind of self-select there. Do I want to go into a combat role? If the answer is yes, boom. Then from there, do you want to go into something like the infantry? So already you've self-selected yourself to join the military, go into combat role, and then say specifically for the infantry or special forces, which is what a lot of the brouhaha and a lot of the concern is right now on certain sides of the aisle. So then if the answer is yes to that, now can you pass it? And so for me, I did not want to go the special forces, the SF route. So in the Army, that'd be Rangers or the Green Berets or Delta Force. So I self-selected myself out, so to speak. I did not want to pursue that. I wanted to stay in artillery. So my point is, the kind of person, the kind of individual is going to want to join the military, want to join a combat branch, job in the military, and then go for something like infantry or special forces. They have already self-selected themselves out or into a lot of things that others would have not. So to do that, you have to be very mentally and physically fit and strong. So that's an entirely different category of people. That's my cat Gretzky's tail. So it is long overdue, and thankfully now women are being allowed to go as far as they can, to let their own capabilities be the determining factor, not those of anybody else, not those of a DoD directive, not those of a directive from a certain branch of the military, but on them. And so the big thing is equal standards, and that is what has been upheld. And I am absolutely thrilled that it's happening now. I'm sorry that it hasn't happened before. There's some questions coming in that I'll answer. But I do remember a few years ago when I was working on the Armed Services Committee, there was a representative by the name of Duncan Hunter, and I believe he's out of California. And so during the NDAA, the National Defense Authorization Act, the budget for the military, he proposed an idea called the Draft Your Daughters Act. So right away, you can get the sexist overtones there. When every single male has to join the military, has to sign up for what's called the Selective Service, it's not called Draft Your Sons Act. So what he was trying to do, and it failed, but what he was trying to do was say, hey, you don't want these weak women, that your daughters that are more precious to you than your sons, going on a battlefield and dying. And he started using very colorful language like eye gouging and the violence of battlefield combat. So that was his take on it. And what he forgot to do, though, he forgot to look over to the right, because there was a former A-10 pilot from Arizona, a woman, a Republican, who was an A-10 pilot and battalion commander, and you should have seen the look on her face, because it's the same party, and she wanted to say, hey, I flew combat missions overseas, and I'm a woman, and I did it. So she still wears an A10 pendant. So that was a really interesting thing to see. Not to mention that I was working for previously, at the time, Representative Tammy Duckworth, now, of course, Senator Tammy Duckworth, who was a Black Hawk pilot who was shot down in Iraq in 2003 and lost both of her legs. So it was pretty audacious for Duncan Hunter, who is a veteran, Marine Corps artillery, to say something like, well, let's have the Draft Your Daughters Act. And I remember the quote he said, I've talked to coffeehouse liberals and people who go to church 5 times a day, and none of them want their daughters drafted. So it was good to see him squirm in his seat. So there is a question coming from Fernando Mandujano, and it is, there have been studies that show that putting women in positions of authority or leadership promotes economic growth and an overall betterment environment for business. What can we, or what can the Congress do to give women better access to these type of positions? Great question. So the first thing is to ensure that they stay open to everybody, period. That there are no subtext, there are no little kind of catch-alls that say, well, you have to be this, otherwise you can't be in this position. So we're doing an okay job of that, and the Me Too movement is helping that, I think. And today, International Women's Day, could not come at a better time to really keep pushing this idea and this concept that women should and need to be treated equally, to include pay. But there are some things. Gretzky. There are something, so that's what we can do. We can also keep an eye on our legislators, our elected officials, and that includes the state level. So when we look at what really truly impacts our day-to-day life, oftentimes it's at the local and state level, and this is coming from someone who's running for U.S. Congress. But what impacts everyone on a day-to-day level is typically the local and state level politics, and that's where, for instance, in Missouri, we're outnumbered, Democrats, Republicans, almost 3-1. And that's where a lot of things can slip by. And so when they have a supermajority and the Democrats can't, the best they can do is fight back and try to slow roll these type of things. But so great question, Fernando. So just put it succinctly, make sure that we're paying attention to the House bills and the Senate bills that go through at the House level, or sorry, at the state level, to ensure there's nothing in there prohibiting women from achieving equal opportunity in the workplace. One good example, I was watching the movie Arrival with Amy Adams with my girlfriend Caitlin a little while ago, last week or so, and I didn't realize it until halfway through or so that Amy Adams was the female. I mean, I knew she was the female lead, but I didn't fully understand and grasp until Caitlin elbowed me and said, "Hey, do you realize that she's the primary character?" And it was refreshing. And it wasn't refreshing just because a woman was in that position, but because of the different way that she went about things. So no spoilers for Arrival if you haven't seen it. I really encourage you to do that. But she's one of the best linguists in the United States. And so she was challenged with trying to understand this alien language, literally alien language. And so, but how she responded to things, her take on things was different. And I really, really enjoyed it, but strong, just in a way that has been very rare on movie screens up until recently. Stephen Jarvis asks, what are your thoughts on Secretary DeVos removing protections for women with respect to campus assault? What will or can you do to keep women safer in college campuses? Awesome question. So when I was with Senator McCaskill, this was a big thing. She was working with Senator Gillibrand out of New York. And so the two areas she was focusing on fighting sexual assault were on military campuses and also college campuses. And so some of the criticism that I would read was, hey, that's great, but why not everywhere else? And the reason why, it's not that she did not want to end sexual assaults everywhere else. The issue was that there is more federal involvement at the university level and Department of Defense installations, so military bases. And the reason why is because obviously the federal government has oversight over military installations, but also plays a major role in funding students to go to school. So they have a more intimate, hands-on approach to what they can and cannot do on college campuses or universities, and also the military. So meaning, sadly, people often don't respond to morality, however we can agree to define that, but they do respond to monetary issues. So if there are there are certain colleges or universities that are not handling the situations well, the federal government can withdraw funding. And so that there does need to be an overhaul on how sexual assaults are reported, but also addressed. So the idea of having an accuser and accusee in the same place is awful. And so there have been a lot of great movements that unfortunately have had to happen. I know that probably the most well-known one is a woman carrying a mattress around to show this is what happened. And another shirt I've seen of the picture of a woman wearing a T-shirt that said, it happened wearing this shirt, and it was a t-shirt. So that is to fight against the idea of they were wearing something that somehow was provocative, which of course it's not, but to somehow invite assault or a verbal abuse or beyond that. So we got to keep pushing. I know we can. I just really want to quickly address the pay gap. So roughly, depending on what sources, it's between 77 and 80 cents. So meaning women earn 77 to 80 cents on the dollar for every dollar that a man makes. There is federal legislation that requires this to be equal. But it has not worked so far. So what I can do is clearly state and repeatedly state that everyone in my office, when elected, will earn the same pay. That is completely blind to gender, to sexual orientation, to anything else other than that person's position and their capabilities. Another question: what we do to help middle-class women with moms with childcare? Awesome. So we need to make sure that we need to make that affordable. So right now, there's a huge gap in between how much money we make. This kind of goes back to the minimum wage conversation we had last week, and also unions, how much people make and what they can actually afford. So increasing wage is only part of it, but if we can't access childcare, then that's a huge issue. So what we can do is lower the barriers to entry. So lower the cost of education or certification for people who do want to enter the childcare arena or the field. And so lower that barrier to entry so that people who want to enter childcare can, and that paying for that education or paying for that certification is not going to be an inhibitor. We've got a lot of work to do, but I could not be more excited to celebrate International Women's Day today. But more importantly, this is one day, but to keep this movement going. So that includes something that's close to me, of course, in the military, but ensuring that women are protected there, that assaults that don't happen, that they are reported, and when they're guilty, when the subject is guilty, that they're dealt with harshly and appropriately. So a lot of that is from culture. In closing thoughts, some of the things out here when I was in the Army, basically, what do you think is going to happen when you mix men and women? That is completely the wrong answer. It's archaic. It's honestly overly simplistic and Neothandral-like. So that's not what happens. Putting men and women together assault is not the inevitable outcome. And if so, then I'd be very disappointed to say that this is my child, that this is just their mindset, that they're 18 and when they wear a uniform of this great military, or when they're on a college campus, that they think this is just acceptable, because that's what happens when we put men and women together, which is absolutely ridiculous. So we need to increase our ability to increase the efficiency of the way that women can report assaults, increase the timeliness that they are dealt with, ensure that accusees and accusers are not kept together, make sure that women are allowed to do everything that they are capable of, not limited to by the government, in the military, and that includes infantry and special forces. Let that person determine what they're capable of, not anybody else. And I always put it on myself and on any leadership position. Imagine telling your daughter, if she wanted to join the military, wanted to go infantry or special forces, imagine explaining to her no, and why. I don't think people could do that. If I have a daughter and she says, Dad, I want to join the infantry, I will be cold on the Missouri ground before I say no. And she says, why? As I watch her eyes fill up with tears, because you're a woman. That is not the answer. So there are a lot of things we can do to close the pay gap, but I'll just keep talking about it and make sure that every chance I get that we address it, and every chance we get in Congress to address it and do it fiercely, and that includes the military. So just let you know, reminder, everyone in the military is paid upon their tenure, so their time in service, and also their pay grade, so their rank. It has nothing to do with gender. So in some ways, I think the military is a really good way to look at that and to apply to the civilian world to make sure that women are paid equally. So thank you all very much. I know we covered a lot of ground. I talked really fast, and hopefully I didn't spur my sleeves too much. But this is a fascinating topic. So if you haven't, hashtag out International Women's Day today on Twitter. Let people know that you saw this, your thoughts, what the United States government can do better at federal level, and then what the state of Missouri and the local government can do better. So this is something that we all can play a part in, and make sure that those elected officials are held accountable. So thank you all very much. We are at 19 minutes, which is 4 minutes past what normally happens, but this is a great topic, and I hope to see you all here next week. Thanks a lot, and enjoy the rest of your Thursday.